don't have any time for questions at the end. And the reason for that is because we want you to ask your questions as soon as they come up. It's meant to be an interactive session. You're also invited to work along with the live coding if you feel like it. In fact, this session is kind of a preview for a session that we'll be doing at the AppSec EU OWASP conference in July, which will take a whole day. And there, the emphasis is really on hands-on. But there should be some opportunity to do some hands-on now, if you feel like it. Otherwise, there are some resources that you can use to try things at home. So let me just introduce myself. I'm a software security architect. I'm the founder of secapdev.org. That's a non-profit organization that organizes a software security course for developers every year in Leuven in collaboration with the T.A.K.E Leuven. I do consultancy, but I also do fixed price projects involving minimal viable products, proof of concepts, pilots, and I also lecture at the Erasmus University College in Brussels. And you have my contact details.
I'm Michael. Michael is actually the pronunciation. I'm a freelance cybersecurity specialist, currently doing a project at Colruyt Group. You probably never heard of it, but it's a retailer in Belgium. I give trainings and I'm really enthusiastic about security. So that's also the reason for this session.
Yes, can I just pick up on that enthusiasm point? So we're both quite passionate about security. We've done quite a lot of work on access control in the past months and years, and we'd like to share as much of that as possible with you. So if any of you feel that they have remaining questions, please put things up on the open space board, because we'd be delighted to tackle any topics that you feel you want to explore further in the open space sessions.
Yes, indeed. So we're gonna just explain a scenario real quick. The idea is that you are the developer of a social network set up by an ISP. So you have a single page application, and it's represented by this iPhone icon, you could say. And that single page application is going to call some backend APIs. Here there's one, but actually we're going to call 3 backend APIs. I'm going to play the API, and Johan will play the client. So Johan has to call me, and I have to make sure that these calls happens securely, and that they happen in a secure manner. So basically, in the end, this is what we will have programmed, hopefully, if everything goes well. The client will actually call 3 APIs, and we will secure these APIs in different manners. That's hopefully the end goal of this project. And the client, it isn't a mobile app, it will be a single page application. It will have 3 components, each component calling one backend API. The backend APIs will be hosted in Azure. And I always doubt about the pronunciation, but I just checked with the Microsoft MVP that Azure is the correct pronunciation. So I'm just going to deploy. I'm not sure if you know Azure. I'm also not an Azure expert, but I'm going to create a function app. So I'm going to create a resource called a function app. And this will help us to set up a serverless API, or several serverless APIs. I just have to give it a name. So you will see me clicking through some screens. If you don't follow everything, it's not a problem. In the end, I will pause at the things that really matter. Just turn off the mouse. we were in East Europe. So now I'm setting up a function app, and the function app will actually host 3 APIs. So a function app, if you don't know it, it's to set up serverless APIs. I'm just have to fill the time when it's starting up. So I'm just repeating myself a little bit there. And also, I'm going to set up an API management service. So you will see it later on the slides. But I'm going to host the APIs, the 3 APIs, behind an API manager. It's the API manager that will take care of the security of the backend APIs. The API management service is here, and I started that this morning. I didn't configure it, but it takes half an hour to start it up. I'm not going to fill half an hour talking here. So this I started this morning. It's completely from scratch, basically. So in the meantime, voila, deployment is succeeded, right on time. Unconf demo is my function app. It does not contain any API at the moment, but I'm going to add a function. I'm going to create a custom function in C#, and I'm going to call it news. Like you saw, I'm just going to switch real quick to the slides. We will have 3 APIs, one called news, one called resource use, and one called friends. So this one is going to be the news. I'm not going to talk about authorization level here. Why? Because all authorization will be taken care of by the API manager. So here, it doesn't really matter. And this thing, I'm not going to do live coding because it's a simple string that has to be returned by the service. So I'm going to do quick copy paste. I'm just going to change the text because this is for the news, and we're going to say there is no news yet. So this API, I'm going to show you in a second. It's publicly accessible using a function code, but the function code, we will ignore that later on. Again, we will use the Azure API Manager. And you see it returns a simple string, there is no news yet. So my API is running. It is a bit secured, but I'm going to come back to that later. I'm just going to create the other functions as well.
You mean it's secured by the code?
By the function code.
Okay.
But the function code, so actually the API manager will be the only one calling these backend APIs directly. We will be calling the API manager. It will become clear in a second. Just going to create the other functions, resource use. Same code. And then we're going to say you have some resources left, for example. Doesn't have to be. Same.
Yeah, since it's an ISP, it might want to give the opportunity to the users to check how much bandwidth they have used, for example. And of course, with just hard coding messages where, in fact, there should be retrieval of some data from a database or calculations or whatever. But I'm sure that you can all imagine that part. We're just concentrating on the security here.
Yeah. So I'm just going to quickly copy paste these 3 URLs that we just, or these 3 APIs that we just created. If I zoom in a bit, so you see that I have 3 APIs, one called friends, one called resource use, one called news. These are the backend APIs. I have to put them behind an API manager. I'm going to do that here live. There is just one thing that I have to do up front, and that is that we're going to say that only GET requests are possible. It's not required, but just it makes things a bit cleaner, so that on these functions we're only going to do GET request. So now my function app is ready. If I collapse them, you see that we have 3 functions running in the function app. The 3 functions that we need in Now I have to do something that I'm just going to go through quickly, because I have to make an open API specification. And here is a small, it's a bit buggy. That's also why they say it's a preview, I guess. Normally if I click twice, it works. So I'm just going to try clicking twice. So hopefully it works then.
So of course, what we're doing here in Azure can also be done on AWS, and I'm sure in other cloud providers. In fact, later on in subsequent sessions, we'll be using AWS as well. We thought that today it would be interesting to use Azure.
Indeed, it's not that we have a personal preference or something, or perhaps a personal preference we do have, but it's not that this.
Yeah, and
is
it's different. The personal preference. Yeah, Stephanie.
So you just define some functions, and Azure builds you an API out of them, and you can generate API docs from that.
Indeed,
Just
yes.
a click of a mouse or 2 clicks.
Yeah, 2 clicks at the moment. And that's useful because when we define these APIs, so now I'm going to have to add or to tell the API manager about these 3 APIs. And it's just a click of a button when we have the open API specification created up front. That's the reason why I made it. So in my API manager, I'm going to add the API, the function app. You see it's all built in. That's why we took it for the demo, because it's going really quick. I can actually browse to my function app that I just created, and it's the Unconf demo 2018. That's the latest one that I just created together with you. And now based on the API specification, it will add this to the API manager. So I don't have to do anything, I just have to add it to a product here. It's a detail. I'm going to create. And what I now have is an API manager who knows about the backend APIs, the 3 APIs. The problem is, of course, and you saw that before, that we have secured these APIs with a code. This is only, and again that's important because otherwise you might get confused later, this will only be used to secure the connection between the API manager and the API. The client will talk to the API manager later on, so the client does not have to know anything about these codes, but I need to know them to configure the API manager.
Yes, so basically these codes passing between the API manager and the functions is Azure's implementation of a kind of private network between the API.
So just quickly back to the slides. I created 3 APIs. At the moment they are publicly accessible. How are we going to secure them? What are the options? What is the simplest way to secure them?
Make a network between the secure network between the APIs and API manager, and API manager to be the only point.
Mm-hmm. But that's for the backend, so that's between API manager and
API manager to the point of the client itself when it's authenticated.
mm-hmm.
You need an authentication layer.
Yeah, indeed. How can we do that? For example.
With the API manager, I think.
Yeah,
An identity
indeed.
manager.
Well, what are we going to add to the API?
Basic.
Sorry? Basic authentication, it's possible, or a simple API key, for example, it's also possible. And that's what we're going to do. So I'm just going to, that's a start there, we're going to see what the better options are later. But I'm just going to show an example of how we can secure an API with a simple API key. I think a lot of us know that there's a common way to secure the API. And that's also, that's also very easy in the Azure API Manager. I'm going to do it for the News API. So for the other APIs later on, we will see better ways of securing them. And I'm just going to show you here with Postman. We have not secured it yet. I can easily request it. And I just it gives back there is no news yet. Simple as that. Of course, that's what we want to avoid when we go to the client. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do some, or add an authorization or an access control policy. And in Azure, it's actually quite nice. So this is the policies that get evaluated when a request comes in at the API manager. And this is specifically for the news API. So what you see is in the backend, it will actually rewrite it to the URL with the function code, what we talked about before. That's for, again, connection API manager, backend API. But I actually want to check on API manager side, on the front end of the API manager, which will be called by the client. And I can just add a simple check HTTP header. So for example, I'm going to call it XAPI-key. And now the API manager will enforce that the client sends a request and adds an authorization, or in this case, XAPI-key HTTP header to the request. If it fails, so if it's not added, I'm going to return a 401. And I'm going to say, for example, unauthorized. I'm not going to ignore cases. And the value is, of course, important. And now we're going to have to find something secret. So I'm just going to come up with something very secret. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 API key. So this is the value of our API key. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to save it. And if all goes well, if I now try to call it again without the XAPI key header, we should get back a 401 here as well as a status code, 401 unauthorized. So now we have a little bit of security, because if I add the header XAPI key with the value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 API key, of course that should be authorized now, and indeed you see I get back at 200. There is no news yet. So that's the first step in securing our API. Now the question is, of course, if you think this is a good way of securing the API.
Or in which circumstances is this a good way of securing the API? I mean, this is a technique that you actually see a lot in the wild, right? API keys is something that is ubiquitous.
Yeah, and why is
the only case when you should use this if the API key is expiring at a specific time and you provide temporary access. It's one of the cases where I would use something like this. But in this example, public client starting with the API gateway, the public client should be considered insecure, and they have access directly to the API key. Yeah. So it's formatting. It's only one more step from having nothing, but you should not ever consider it secure in this specific case.
Yeah, so this is a really good point. You can make a distinction between so-called public API clients and what confidential, I think, is the term, API clients. So public API clients are those clients that the end user can obtain. So actually our single page application is an instance of a public API client. And of course, those can be reverse engineered by an attacker. And so the API key, if it has to be in the client, can be extracted, and then the attacker can use it in another context. So in principle, we shouldn't be using it in the configuration that we will be using it, because it's an SPA, it's a public client, as opposed to a web app, where it would be very much more difficult for the attacker to obtain the key. But nonetheless, you see API keys used quite often in mobile apps and in SPAs. And the idea is, well, you know, the resource that we're trying to protect is not that crucial. We only want to have some measure of protection against use by clients that are unofficial, that we haven't provided.
Yeah, it's quite easy, of course. So that's the reason why it's used so often. But like you say, it has a lot of disadvantages. We have tried to list some of the disadvantages. If we have multiple clients, so in this demo we will only have one single page app calling the API. But it's possible that we want to be able to call the API from multiple clients, perhaps returning different information based on the user who is using the client. And then we have to make sure that we somehow know which user is actually using the single page application. And what you said, how to securely distribute the API key, is also an issue. If it's in the open, then everybody can just call our APIs. Revoking, limiting access, it's all very difficult with API keys. You can just switch it off, take a different value in the API key configuration, but then it's on or off. And that's, there are some of the difficulties. There are a lot of other problems probably with this approach. So we're going to try to do better for the next API. And now we're going to take a deep dive. I mean, not very deep yet, that's for Johan. I'm just going to click some buttons. But we're going to make use of access tokens. And I'm sure you heard of OAuth 2 access tokens. I'm not going to start with the theory, I'm going to start with the example. And again, I go back, and this time I'm just going to start with resource use. And I'm also going to change the inbound processing here, just like I did with the news item, where I added an authorization header or an XAPI key header. There is actually a policy available in the API manager, an inbound policy. And if you scroll down, it's very simple. You just have to find it. Validate JWT, so JWT, you pronounce it. Sorry?
JSON Web Token.
JSON Web Tokens, yes, indeed. It's kind of becoming the standard format for access tokens, although you could use a different format as well.
Yeah,
we'll talk about that.
It's a de facto standard rather than a de jure.
Yeah.
So OAuth does not standardize the format of access tokens.
Yeah.
But by the way, is there anyone who has a clean glass that I could have some water in, because I'm getting a bit croaky?
So,
do you want one?
Oh yeah, please. So you see that now a policy has been added, validate JSON Web Token. I'm just going to simplify it a little bit so that we don't get overwhelmed immediately. Actually just removed the, because basically the idea behind an access token is that it needs to be provided by a trusted party. Thank you. And the thing is, I have to tell my API manager what a trusted token is. We'll see the format of an access token later.
Can people read this?
No.
Is it possible to enlarge it?
I don't think
yes. Okay. This needs to be a compromise.
Or maybe the magnifier from Windows.
Sorry?
Magnifier from Windows.
the magnifier. Yeah, but that takes a lot of practice. I'm not sure.
The idea is certainly not that you read all this code
No,
Maybe if you just.
I'm
say
going to
what
try
it-
to use a magnifier and we'll see what happens. Is it better? Readable? So the policy just added the validate JOT, and I'm going to add something here, namely an OpenID config URL. And that's actually the URL which will contain most of our configuration. So we kind of dynamically configure the security here based on an URL which is somewhere else. And the other URL, I store it here. This is actually the URL. So you see it's a reference to auth0. I'm going to open it in the browser. And auth0 is, you don't have to read this. This is, I'm just going to zoom in if you like to. Auth0 will be the trusted party who will be issuing our access tokens. And there will be a lot more later in the session. For now, you just have to know that I have to tell the API manager that we trust auth0 to issue tokens which may be used to access our API.
So we've set up an authorization server, a hosted authorization server with auth0. This is a very simple thing to do, and any of you can just create an account and you automatically will get an authorization server. And we've done a very minimal configuration of that authorization server. We've defined one backend application and one client application.
And you see, so this is actually from the OpenID Connect standard. You can dynamically configure your API, or you can dynamically retrieve the configuration basically from a .wellknown/OpenID configuration URL. So all authorization servers or OpenID Connect providers who follow the standard should provide such an URL where we can read. I just have to change the HTTP header. For the API key, we used X API key. Here, we're going to use the authorization header, standard authorization header, to pass the access token with. Just have to make sure that I don't miss anything, so I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. The audience, I'm just going to fill in. Again, we will explain more about it later, but an access token can be issued for multiple audiences. For example, if we have multiple API managers running in Azure, or perhaps multiple API managers separated over different locations, we might be using different audiences. We have now, and Johan will show that later as well, our API will receive an audience of backend. What's also important, and that I'm not gonna explain in detail at the moment, but our token will also contain a scope that we're gonna check. So now the policy for the resource use should be ready. So I have the validate JOT. I configured authorization, the header in which we will pass the access token. I configured the, this will be better, the OpenID config URL, and I configured the audience. So I'm going to save it. I'm going to check the resource use. So if I now just try to call it directly, it should give me an error. It indeed gives me an error for one unauthorized. It's not authorized. Why? Because we need an access token. There is a lot to say about how you can actually retrieve these access tokens, and that's part of the talk that Johan will have. So I'm just gonna, for the sake of going forward a bit, retrieve an access token, and you can get a glimpse that I'm going to auth0 to get this access token. Actually, the instance that we trusted. So I get back an access token, and if I now add it as an authorization header, because I specified it, and I have to add bearer and then the access token, I'm going to send the request, and we failed. So let's see why we failed. I'm just going to open the access token. And there is a nice, probably, or perhaps you've already heard of it, but there is a nice debugger tool for access tokens called jot.io. You can just paste the token in the encoded part, and then you actually get back or get the decoded version of the token. So you see it's issued by summer 2018 by auth0, which is correct. The audience is also correct. Client credentials, but what's missing here, and that's what I'm going to remove. Here it's here. The scopes. So I don't see a scope here in this token. So I'm going to remove it from the required claims. That makes it actually a bit simpler. Scope, you can even limit it further. For example, limit it to only call the resource use API, or limit the clients to only call the friends API. So I'm going to save it. Let's see if we get in.
So maybe just briefly a clarification of what this scope thing actually is. So the intention of the scope, so the audience that Michael, that Michael specified says who the access token is for. So if I get an access token that is meant for someone else, I shouldn't accept it, right? If I get an access token, if I'm the Friends API and I get an access token for, that's a bad example actually. If I'm the Google API and I get an access token for Facebook, I'm going to reject it, right? That's clear. Now, a Google API will have a vast range of operations that you can do on it. And that's what the scope actually specifies, right? It says this access token gives the permission to execute these things.
To see your email, but not your friends, for example, in the case of Facebook. Yeah. So, just to be clear now, the call passed. It gave back a 200 OK. Just because I removed the scope check. I will edit later again because we actually want to do the check. The more security, the better. And just again, taking a look at the access token. So we have the issuer, we have the audience, which Johan just explained. We also have an expiry. So the problem with the X API key that we had before is not present here anymore because it's going to expire. The other ones, perhaps we will touch upon them later, but I'm not going to go into detail unless there are questions. And now actually we have a pretty nice setup, right? Because we have the access token, we have the API manager who validates the incoming token, and the access token is now a JOT, which is signed, and I didn't talk about the signatures yet, but what stops an attacker from just sending an access token which is issued by himself? Because this is just, I mean, perhaps not everybody, but this is just something that you can make yourself, right?
Yeah, maybe we should talk a little bit about the structure of the JOT. Yeah. So according to the JOT specification, it's an IETF specification. It consists of 3 parts, right? It consists of a header and a payload. Secondly, payload, and thirdly, you have the signature. And in the encoded part, you can distinguish them because they're separated by dots, full stops. Right? These things are base 64 encoded, so they're not encrypted. Right? It doesn't give you any confidentiality, at least not by default. There is a possibility of encrypting it, but this is rarely used, I would say. So the header is specifying how the JOT is signed and or encrypted. Okay? and then you have the signature right at the bottom, and this tool actually tells you whether the signature is valid. But if you can you scroll a bit further down, Michael? Yeah. So the signature has been verified. Now you may ask yourself, well, how did it verify this signature? Yeah, we just pasted this seemingly random jot in this interface. So any ideas on how this signature is verified?
It is
Give it clues.
It is the public key from
Right.
the issuer.
Right, yes, exactly. And do you know how it gets that public key from the issuer?
I think it's public.
Yes, so it can get the public, but you know, how does it know the issuer, for example, where to get the key from?
Well, the first part contains also the issuer.
Actually, can we look at the header? And so actually the issuer is in the payload, but maybe that's actually not very logical. It would be more logical if it were to be in the header. But so because the issuer is known, and because there is this specification in the standard that there should be a well-known OpenID configuration, it can retrieve that, and it can retrieve, and it can look in there where the keys are. Yeah. And this is in fact what happens if you look at the traffic, the network interactions when you place
Yeah, so in the well-known OpenID configuration there is indeed a link which contains the public keys of that issuer. And if you, each time you paste a token inside here on jot.io, it will actually, and that's why I opened the network tab, it will retrieve the public keys based on the well-known OpenID configuration of that issuer. And that's what we see here. So perhaps in the it's not visible for everybody, but there has been a call to jwks.json, which is hosted on summer2018.eu.auth0.com. That's where we actually got the access token from as well. So what jot.io does is actually taking a look at the issuer, then contacting the well-known link OpenID configuration of that issuer, and then as a third point, see where it can find the public keys to validate the signature. So it all happens in the backend if you use jot.io.
But this is also what's going to happen in Azure, right?
Yeah, indeed. So that's the same that I have here. The thing we configured before. OpenID config URL. I also created the link to .wellknown.o/OpenID configuration. It will use the information on this link to actually validate the tokens that are coming in via the authorization header. So in the back, it will also call the JWKS URL to retrieve the public.
Here I have to do some React specific things, like I'm going to be using a state, and when the state changes, the component is going to be reloaded. So I need that because the call to the backend happens asynchronously, so I'm going to call the state change when the call returns. So what I need to do is I need to say that the state is empty initially, like this. Yeah, super props is, I mean, just boilerplate. So we have an initially empty state, and if we have in the render method of this component, I'm going to check
whether the message has been set in the state yet. Sorry, this state message. And if it has, then I'm going to show the message.
So it's a null check that we do.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, it's not good code, but and so if there is no message in the state, nothing will happen. Oops, that is not right. Yeah, this is code. I indicate that as follows in React. So it's gone. Okay, so once the call to the backend returns, I want to set the state. How am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to when the component loads, I'm going to make a backend call, and when the backend call, I'm going to call a function that indicates that the state has changed. Component did mount. That's a standard. That's a function that React will call whenever the component mounts is displayed. So what I do there is I do Axios. I make a backend call with the following configuration. The URL is and then I have to look at Michael's. It's the same as the one that we tested, I believe. Is that right?
Summer 2018.azureapi.net. So it's without a test.
Ah, it's without a test. Okay, but I'm going to copy this anyway. Sorry.
Now you gave away that we tested it.
So I'm going to be calling that URL, and then when I have the answer, so that's the result. Then I'm going to call this set state message. I'm going to set the data. Okay, so is that going to work?
Is it going to work? Yeah?
Well, nothing is happening. And here I get unauthorized, right? Logical?
You don't have a
How did we secure the news API? With the API key, so we're just going to demo it here with the API key as well. Even though the access token is better, that we will use for the other components.
So I have to add a header in the Ajax call. So the header was called X API key, and then I remember the secret: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 API key.
It's a good secret,
Yeah, it's easy to remember. And we still don't get anything. Oh dear. Oh dear. So we get, this is a weird one, huh? So we made an options call. Does anyone understand what's going on here?
Yeah, we just calls like.
Sorry?
No, we only have get calls. Sorry.
Yeah. We only have get calls in the API. Yeah.
But why are we making an options call here?
Course.
Course, excellent, excellent. So, does anyone care to explain what about course? Yeah?
The browser is trying to retrieve the list of hosts which are allowed to make the request to that endpoint.
So can you speak up?
The browser is trying to retrieve the lists of hosts that are authorized by the backend to make the call to the server.
Okay. So that's the gist of it. So the web the web's arguably most important security policy is the same origin policy, which means that you can only by default interact with resources on the same origin. Now, what is an origin? Origins are triples of protocol, host, and port. Okay. So our origin is HTTP localhost 3000, but the origin of the API is clearly a different one. Okay. So in principle, we shouldn't be able to make that AJAX call. Now that's of course a nuisance, and this would be a showstopper for any use of APIs. So I believe it's a W3C subsequently standardized something called CORS, which is cross-origin resource sharing. Okay, and it's something that developers come up against again and again and again, it's most developers think it's a real pain, but in a way it is, but it's not that difficult to sort out. Actually, did you sort it out?
Well, just now actually. So the way to solve it is not to just add star and allow all origins. So that's actually what I did. So. It's not a good practice. I should actually add, I think it's running on localhost or something.
Right, yes.
But just to be quick, in the policy manager of Azure, I'm not going to show it because then we have to switch screens. I can just add to the inbound policy a course policy. And then I can add the allowed origin, allowed methods, these things. I just put that everything should be allowed now, so it should be working. I'm not sure did you refresh.
Okay, so and basically works through headers, right? The server returns headers that say,
So the API will return a header to the client saying that indeed it's allowed to access resources which are present on the API, which is a different origin and cross origin. That's the reason. So it should be working.
Okay. For some reason, I still have an access token hanging around here. Okay, there's still a problem. What is the problem now? I never made a request. Hang on, it's the second one. Okay, it did retrieve. Okay, there it is. There is no news yet. So it looks like our first component is done. So let's move on to the second one. So the second one is resource use.
Yeah, so this is an important one. Now we're going to get a view more on the flow between the client and the Auth0 server. Because what Johan will configure now is actually the client will basically go get a token at the Auth0 server. Token comes back and then use the token to access the API.
Yeah. So this is basically the flow that we'll be using. So we'll get a password from the user. Now I would like to show this with nice input boxes, etc. And there is a repo on GitHub which does that, and it's not that much code. It's what 10 extra lines of code, but I'm not going to write them today. I'm just going to hard code the username and password here. But you know, please retrieve the repo and see for yourself how it can be extended. But as I said, now the main purpose is to show the mechanisms. So I'm going to make this other component, resource use .js, and so I'm having to do some footwork here. In the latest, yeah, I said that already. Okay. So, and I've got that here. So if I import resource use, yes, thank you. Okay. There's a problem.
Class resource.
Okay. Okay. So, why doesn't it do it a second time?
Semicolon at the end.
No, the semicolons don't matter.
You change the URL as well.
I have, yeah. Well, no, I would have. Here we are. We've done the call twice, and both components have come up with the same thing. But yes, we are going to change the URL. Of course, we don't want to go to news. Is there any protection by the API key? I don't think so. So I could throw this one away.
Yeah. It's just the access token.
I see. Okay. So the access token, I'm going to have to put in an authorization header.
Yeah. I could change it actually. You saw that I configured authorization header in the policy, but it's part of the standard to put the access token in the authorization header as a bearer token. We're following the standard.
And then I should put the access token here. Now I would like to make a button actually that will allow me to retrieve the to say when I'm retrieving the resources. So I'm importing the button from React Bootstrap. So now I'm going to say if there is no message, then show the button. Would this work? Okay, so I've got my button. It's not doing anything, of course. Because I need to define a handler. Well, I'll call it handler. So I'm defining a function handler. And it takes a click event. And so what do I need to do? I need to go and get a token, an access token, and when I get the access token back, I then need to use that to make the call, right? So in fact, this stuff here, I need to do as part of the handler. But first I have to retrieve the access token. So I first have to make a call to the issuer.
Yeah, that's this call actually. So we're going to get a token from the Auth0 server.
No, what was that again? Maybe this is a good opportunity to show you the Auth0 server. We have defined an API called backend. The Auth0 management API is their standard. That's in order to automate tasks, etc. So this is the one that we've defined. Its identifier is backend, and that's the value that is going to go into the audience field.
That's what I configured in the policy, right? The audience was backend.
And we see that the signing algorithm used. This is not what I was looking for. Yeah, we've got the client. This is what I was looking for. We're developing the React REST client, and that has a client ID which I will need, and I'm also going to scroll down here. Can people see this, by the way? Yeah. Because it gives me the URL where I can get the token. That's
so
what I need here.
In Auth0 we have to configure the client and we have to configure the API. That's what Johan just showed. From the client we need to call the token endpoint of the Auth0 server. The authorization server has several endpoints. We need to get a token, and that's why we need to call the token endpoint, and that's the URL OAuth/token, because we're going to use the OAuth token, OAuth folder, OAuth grant.
So I need to give my credentials. Normally you would do this in text boxes. I'm going to do it in this case hard-coded. I'm going to hard-code it in this case. Okay, so when I've done that call to the issuer, I'm then going to, and I get the result back. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that result.
So this is a token. I think it's the official image for a token. But it's coming back from Auth0. And what we're going to do is, of course, we're going to send it along with the request to the API. So that's the next step that needs to happen.
So I'm going to splice in the token here, and I hope I get the syntax right. I'll just do do I just do this? I think so.
Sorry.
It's not clear to me how we manage this username and password. Let's say we have a mobile application that we want to secure that. Where is the username and password there, and how
That's
you
a
secure it?
very good question, because it's a discussion we have to start. So the question is, how do we manage the username password? Because okay, it's now hard coded, but in this flow, the user would actually enter username password in the mobile application. Is it something that we want?
Do I have to configure username and password in OAuth0 for all my users? Because
Well, you could show a screen in your mobile app asking for a username password, and then your mobile app would take this username password to Auth0, log in at the token endpoint, and it gets back a token.
yeah, but that's the username and password of the user. So I have to have for each user a configuration on how it's needed.
Yeah, the users need to be known here. And so you need to actually register your users here, or you can link to an external database. But my question then is this a good practice?
Just so I understand better, Auth0 is basically just an identity provider.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
GitHub or Google or Facebook or whatever.
For example, yeah, indeed. We didn't want to take Facebook or Google as an example, because then it can get quite confusing. But indeed, it's actually an identity provider, issuing tokens back to your mobile application, for
So
example.
usually my user would have already an account at Auth0.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Typically in enterprises can be also an enterprise security token service, for example, where your users are in an Active Directory, I don't know what you have, or an SQL database. But then the question, I like your example of Facebook. Well, Johan is working.
Yes, I'm getting in a mess here. I'm sorry. So keep talking, please.
So usually, and I'm sure you have tested this or you have used this, there are a lot of apps that can use Facebook to log in, right? But the question is, which credentials do you need to provide here in the mobile app? If this would be Facebook.
Your Facebook credentials.
Your Facebook credentials. Is it something you want to do?
No.
Why not?
GDPR.
Oh, there is it. Now somebody said blockchain.
Someone might write an application that would just collect users' passwords.
Yeah, indeed, because this is an untrusted mobile application. I don't necessarily trust the developer of the application. I don't necessarily trust Johan for not mining passwords or indeed storing them. And basically, we just show this as a demo, but you should never use this flow. So that's a takeaway, because the whole idea behind OAuth and OpenID Connect is that you, as a developer of this application, you don't have to worry about user credentials anymore. The better way, and that's the next flow if we get there, if we ever get there, is that your mobile application or your browser application, it redirects to actually to Facebook, for example, and that's something that you often see nowadays, almost always, I hope. When you click login with Facebook, you get redirected to the Facebook login page. And you basically enter your credentials only in Facebook. You don't give them to the mobile application. And that's also possible using OAuth or OpenID Connect. It's just a different flow. So we have a slide later where we mention the different flows. There is implicit grant, there is resource owner password grant, which you should not be using. There is authorization code grant. We don't have time to actually show all of them, of course. But this is a very good remark that the resource owner password grant for OAuth should not be used in real life. And I really like the remark. I think the best example, or the latest example, I'm not sure if it's still here, but I heard from Johan. On LinkedIn, you could link your Outlook account and to get some more known friends or contacts. And to do that link, you had to enter your username, password of your Outlook account straight into LinkedIn, which is not, of course, not good practice, but it's what used to happen a lot when we used Facebook login or Google login, that the mobile app asks for username and password.
Can I just interrupt? I'm making progress here. I'm at the stage where it's telling me you can't do a GET request on the authorization server, right? Sorry.
No problem. Yeah, I think it's basically clear now. So indeed, we never should use a resource owner password grant because we don't trust the application or the single page applications which can indeed start mining my credentials. So the better way, and that's hopefully a flow that we can still show in 15 minutes because we have to, we only have 15 minutes left, is that here you redirect to a browser. And for mobile, the current, well, best practice, but it can be a personal opinion, is that your mobile app that you developed redirects to the Safari browser, for example, or the default Android browser.
Client secret.
And that your browser then connects to Auth0 or Facebook.
I'll try.
And we can do that again with the implicit flow that we're going to show later. That's a very good remark.
Would you try more an application that redirects you to Facebook and asks you for credentials there? Why? Because I can clone that and just fake redirect you?
Yeah, well that's why, and you saw that in the Auth0 screen, we had to register the client here. So we have registered the API and also the client. So if you want to use Facebook as an authentication provider, as an identity provider, you have to configure your client in the Facebook developer console. So, and that's also why there is a client ID normally. Sometimes for, and that's what Johan explained at the beginning, for confidential clients, there's also a client secret. If there can't be a client secret for mobile apps, it's a bit unsure because they can get reverse engineered, etc. Typically, you also work with redirect URLs, so you can actually make it very hard for attackers to fake a client that is not trusted by Facebook, because we have a client ID, we have redirect URLs, and these things. So Johan?
Yeah, I'm a bit stumped here. So I'm getting access denied on the authorization server. Stephanie said you need to fill in the client secrets. Suggested.
I don't know if you need to, but I saw it on the auth server that there is one. So
Yes, there is one. I don't think that that's the problem, but we'll try it anyway. Yes, I think I missed a comma somewhere.
The danger of live coding.
Yeah. Let me go, if we still have the same problem, let me go and get some inspiration from the repo.
The audience?
Yeah, well, we haven't got to that part yet. This is, yes, of course. It needs to be wrapped in the data. So let me see. This actually indicates that it needs to be in the body of the post request. Silly me.
Any other questions?
have you ever developed an app for iOS or Android and tried to store a client secret in a secure way there?
Have we tried?
So the answer is no. Can it be done?
On
Maybe.
iOS, probably. On Android, only if the user sets their password.
If what?
If the user has a password set up for their phone. But
Yes.
if they don't lock their phone, you don't have any encryption with utilities.
Yes, yes, yes. So there are APIs on those platforms that allow you to store secrets. So it should be possible. So I believe that what I'm doing here is actually not needed.
Are there still users that don't set a password on their phone?
Unfortunately, yes.
So what if I don't have an user? Let's say my app is, I don't know, server that wants to.
Also, a good question, because now we're touching on all the flows that exist in Auth0. So there is another flow or another grant, the client credentials grant. And indeed, if you have a server application, I don't have another image with me, but a server application, there is no user actually using that server. But sometimes the server will also have to call APIs. Then we can configure the client credentials flow, which actually is username password for the server. So it's quite similar to the resource owner password flow that you should never use for normal users. But the client credentials flow lets you configure username password of the server, with which you can get an access token at the Auth0 server or at the authorization server. And then using that access token, the server can call the API.
So I made a little bit of progress. The token is now coming back, but I'm getting unauthorized on the resource use API. I thought that might be because the audience was missing, but that didn't solve the problem.
Can you find headers in the developer tools?
Sorry?
Can you see the headers
Yes.
of the request?
Yes. So, but the interesting stuff is actually going on in the body, right?
Sorry?
The interesting stuff is actually going on in the body,
Yeah.
because I'm submitting.
Yeah, but
No,
the
it's very clear.
authorization is undefined.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if you look at that header, it's
Yeah.
better
Just
than
go down to
undefined.
witness headers, authorization.
Oh, I see.
Lower.
Right, yes. Yes,
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
yes.
Here.
Yeah. Oh, that's definitely a problem. Yes.
And if you go on token,
I was solving another problem. So let me just fill this in as a. So here. Yes. Should I say yes? Let me again look at.
There's a data pop.
Data, yes, I have to get into the data. Actually, it's the same mistake as I made on the sending side. Okay. So what's happening now? So now it's actually returning. Now the problem presumably is a display problem.
It works.
It works.
Go back.
Oh, it works? Oh, right, okay. Great. So the intention was to also show you the friends component, but I guess that we should wrap up.
Well, perhaps we can take a look at the next slide indeed.
Yeah, so the friends component, we were planning to develop the friends component with the implicit grant flow, or rather the implicit grant OAuth, implicit OAuth grant, and there you're not handing your credentials to the app anymore, but you're authenticating with the authorization server.
Yeah, that's what we explained before. Instead of the resource owner password grant, you redirect to the browser, and the browser will log in to Facebook, or in this case, also. Would it be nice to demo it indeed?
Yeah, I can demo it with the repo. That's all done. But
perhaps we can also, if you're interested in the open space session, go further.
So this implicit grant, OAuth implicit grant, is trivially extendable to the OpenID Connect implicit flow. And the difference between the two is that with the OpenID Connect flow, you get an ID token as well as an access token. And
so there are two tokens coming back then from the Auth0 server, basically. So it's OpenID Connect is indeed an extension of OAuth. And the important thing is that you will use the access token to call the API, but the ID token will remain at the client. That's the extension that OpenID Connect makes, because then you can use identity information in your client as well. You should not be using the access token to determine who is logged in. The access token is just to call the API, while the identity token is for the client to determine the identity of the user logging in.
yeah, so the access token is said to be opaque in the standard, opaque to the client. Yeah, so the client gets it and it sends it on. It doesn't consume it itself. The ID token, on the other hand, is consumed by the client. So we've made a little graph of the various grants and flows, various grants in OAuth 2 and the flows in OpenID Connect, and how they map to each other. So OpenID Connect considers identity information as resources that need to be access controlled. So OpenID Connect has basically a number of basically wraps the grants. Now what we've done,
almost.
What we were intending to do today was to demonstrate the implicit flow in OpenID Connect. I'm sorry that we didn't make it. But what we did actually demonstrate was the resource owner password credentials grant.
Which you should not be using.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
On the whole. That's for discussion, but personal opinion, perhaps.
So this was slated as an architectural session. So it's only right and proper that we very quickly in the wrap up look at what we've learned from an architectural point of view in this discussion. Now there are many things that we could have learned, but I think that the only thing that really should stand out, and I hope we've convinced you of that, is that it's a good idea to create so-called choke points for access to your sensitive resources, to create an entity that must be in the call chain, that must mediate the calls. Maybe less explicitly, separation of concerns. So what we've done is we have removed the need for entity authentication from the backend, and we've put that in an authorization server. And we think that that's a good idea from an architectural perspective, because you want to keep the business logic as business oriented as possible. You want the least possible amount of infrastructure code in your business logic. This holds true for authentication, this holds true for authorization as well. Now it turns out that for authentication that's relatively straightforward to achieve. For authorization that's more difficult, because the
tends to be a fairly tight coupling between business logic and authorization rules. I mean, this is one of my pet subjects. How do you manage to nonetheless achieve some decoupling, but we won't have time to go into that now.
1, 2, 3 quickly.
Okay, so things that we haven't really covered is that your services should be stateless, and that is actually enabled to a certain extent by this way of working. Performance we haven't really talked about. There are many more topics that should be covered in this respect, such as identity management. How do you define, keep track of your users, the access rules, who is allowed to do what, who is allowed to set these rules, etc., etc. Here there are some resources that you may care to look at. So the repo for the client is at the top. Then Michael has got a repo that not only does this kind of thing, but also goes into SAML, for example.
Yeah.
He also uses another authorization server than Auth0. He uses identity server.
Identity server.
And Keycloak too?
No.
No, okay. The next one, the one on my GitHub repo has a Docker container with a authorization server based on Keycloak. Job.io, you've seen, you should familiarize yourself with course, as we mentioned, and then there are some standards that are worth reading. So that's it. I'm sorry if we made you late for lunch.
Oh, we still have 2 minutes.
Oh, we still have 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so
Any questions?
thank you very much. And are there any further questions?
Okay, I'm also hungry.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.